In a storm-filled Congress chamber, Jasmine Crockett confronts Mike Johnson, accused of taking $2 million to ram through Bill 81, a law selling America's future to a foreign empire. Johnson rages, Jasmine unleashes proof like gunfire, and the room trembles under the weight of betrayal. One career shatters, a nation gasps. Will Jasmine Crockett's truth finally bury Mike Johnson, or will his power strike back harder than ever? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The chamber was heavy with silence, every breath weighed down by the gravity of what was about to unfold. The words Energy Bill 81 were written across every mind, a bill suspected of being sold to a foreign oil giant that would lock America's energy future in chains. The room was tense, rigid, as lawmakers shifted in their seats, knowing this was no ordinary session. Then the doors opened and Mike Johnson entered, his stride slow, confident, almost taunting. His eyes scanned the hall with the arrogance of a man who believed himself untouchable. He took his place at the center, leaning back as if the chair were a throne, lips curling into a smug grin. The sound of his voice cut through the air like a blade. "This must be another cheap play of yours, Congresswoman, another little show for you to stay relevant." The insult dropped like a stone into still water, the ripples of shock running through the room. A few lawmakers shifted uncomfortably, while others stared, waiting for Jasmine to react. Johnson's smirk widened, certain that he had already won the first move. Jasmine sat still, her face unreadable, her posture calm but unyielding. For a moment she let the silence drag, her eyes locked on him without so much as a blink. Then she leaned forward, pressing the microphone button with deliberate slowness. Her voice came low, controlled, but every word struck with force. "I don't perform, Mr. Johnson. I present the truth. And today the truth will not bend to your arrogance." Her words hung in the air, sharper than any gavel, slicing through his smirk and leaving the chamber frozen. The sting of Jasmine's calm declaration still lingered in the air, and for a moment the chamber seemed to hold its breath. Johnson's smirk faltered only briefly before his face hardened, and then he erupted with venom. He leaned forward, fists striking the table with a dull, echoing thud that startled even the stenographer in the corner. His voice rose like a whip, sharp and unrelenting. "You are nothing more than a political puppet, a disgrace to this Congress, and a woman unworthy of sitting across from me." The insults rolled off his tongue with practiced cruelty, each one laced with contempt, designed not only to wound Jasmine, but to humiliate her in front of every lawmaker in the chamber. His words sliced through the silence, deliberate and merciless, and the chamber seemed to shrink around the heat of his fury. Eyes darted across the room as the tension deepened, lawmakers glancing at one another with unease but not daring to intervene. Johnson was not finished. He jabbed his finger in Jasmine's direction, his knuckles white, spit clinging to his lips as he shouted, "I have never taken a single dollar, not one. This circus you've created is nothing but a lie, a cheap ploy to drag my name through the mud while you bask in the spotlight like some desperate actress." His words thundered with such force that even the walls of the chamber seemed to tremble. The more he spoke, the louder his voice became, until veins rose against his temples, his chest heaving like a man fighting to keep control, but failing. It was rage, but beneath that rage was a fear so raw, it betrayed him to those who knew how to look. And yet, through this storm of fury, Jasmine did not flinch. She sat unmoving, her posture straight, her eyes locked on him with the stillness of stone. The more he hurled insults, the more her silence grew into a weapon of its own, filling the chamber with an invisible pressure. Seconds stretched painfully, the weight of her refusal to react pressing harder on Johnson than any words could. Finally she moved, slowly, deliberately, leaning toward her microphone. Her voice came out low and cold, each syllable measured like the drawing of a blade. "Then let the evidence speak for itself." The words hung in the air, chilling and final, and in that instant the balance of the chamber shifted. Every head turned to Johnson, and the smirk that once defined him was gone. The first strike had been made, and though no evidence had yet been shown, everyone felt the tremor of what was coming. The chamber was wound tight, Every pair of eyes locked on Jasmine as she reached into her folder and drew out a set of documents, each sheet stamped with the seal of an international bank. She spread them carefully across the desk, sliding one to the clerk, one to Johnson, and holding another high so the overhead projector could cast its details onto the glowing screen above. The numbers were unmistakable. Millions moved in neat, deliberate lines. Her voice was calm, but every word carried the weight of a blade. These are bank statements showing multiple transfers totaling $7,350,000. They were wired from Orion Energy Holdings, a foreign oil consortium, directly into the account of a shell company called Havenbrook Consulting, LLC. Gasps rippled across the chamber as dates flickered on the screen. March 14th, April 3rd, May 9th. Three separate wires, each over $2 million, each time days before Johnson's sudden push for Energy Bill 81. Johnson let out a harsh, mocking laugh, leaning back in his chair with a sneer, as if the weight of the evidence were a joke. He flicked his copy of the statement with two fingers, the papers bending like they were nothing. His voice boomed into the microphone. "A meaningless piece of paper. I don't know this company." The words cracked like a shield hastily raised, loud enough to echo but thin enough for the room to hear the tremor beneath. His eyes darted briefly to the projection before snapping back to Jasmine, trying to smother the rising whispers of disbelief that were already rolling through the chamber. Jasmine didn't so much as flinch. Her hand moved slowly, deliberately, tracing a line down the statement until it reached the registered account holder's field. Her finger tapped the screen once, sharp and undeniable. Then she lifted her gaze to Johnson, her voice slicing through his laughter. "Please look at the account holder's name. Your wife." The words cracked the room open. Lawmakers gasped, some leaning forward, others exchanging stunned glances as the name Elaine Johnson glared from the screen in stark black ink. The chamber felt as though it had erupted without sound, every breath sharp, every eye drilling into the man now cornered. For a single second, Johnson froze. His mouth hung open mid-breath, his face drained pale before his pride clawed its way back. He sputtered, shaking his head, muttering denials under his breath before forcing them into the microphone. Louder, harsher, angrier. "I don't know this company," he repeated, his words tripping over themselves. His hand twitched against the paper as if to crumple it, but he stopped, realizing the cameras were watching. The sweat came next, first a glisten along his temple, then a bead rolling down his cheek, betraying him to everyone in the room. The chamber was no longer still. It was alive, thrumming with the heat of revelation, and Johnson was the only man sweating in the fire. The moment Jasmine uttered the words, "Please look at the account holder's name. Your wife?" It was as if a fault line cracked straight through the chamber. The ripple of shock was instant. Murmurs broke out, pens stopped moving, and heads turned toward Johnson with a sharpness usually reserved for moments of complete collapse. For a few frozen seconds, he didn't move. Then something in him snapped. His chair screeched back as he lunged forward, planting both fists on the table with a force that made the microphones tremble. The veneer of control he'd worn so confidently all morning shattered in an instant. His voice exploded, raw and furious, bouncing off every wall of the hearing room. "You are a liar, a piece of trash in a dress who thinks she can smear my name." The words weren't just angry. They were vicious, personal, soaked in contempt. It wasn't politics anymore. It was a man cornered, swinging wildly. The room recoiled. A few people gasped aloud. One aide covered her mouth. Johnson's face burned red as he turned to the committee chair and shouted again, louder this time, as if volume could erase what had been said. He slammed his open palm onto the wood, the sound sharp and jarring. "Remove Jasmine from the hearing room." His finger stabbed toward the exit like a threat. "Now!" His entire body was trembling, not with strength, but desperation. Lawmakers immediately erupted. Some shouted back at him, demanding decorum. Others looked away in discomfort, as if watching something they weren't supposed to see. A few called out, "Sit down," or "This is out of order." But Johnson didn't hear them, or didn't care. His breathing was shallow, erratic, his chest rising and falling in uneven bursts. The glare in his eyes was no longer one of power. It was panic. And Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't move a muscle. Her hands were calmly folded over the documents in front of her. When she finally leaned in, it wasn't to retaliate. It was to remind everyone who still had control of the facts. Her voice was even, deliberate, and sharper than anything Johnson had just screamed. "Mr. Johnson, I don't need to shout. I have the truth." The sentence landed like a thunderclap. No one dared respond. The echo of her words seemed to settle into the bones of the room. Johnson froze, lips parted, eyes wide. Not because he'd been bested in volume, but because he realized too late that his rage had exposed something deeper than guilt. Fear. He stood there, silent now, as a bead of sweat traced slowly from his temple to his jawline. And for the first time all morning, he looked small. The weight of Jasmine's words, "I have the truth," still hung in the air like smoke when she reached calmly for the remote in front of her. Without a word, she tapped a single button. The chamber lights dimmed slightly, the projector hummed to life, and the massive screen behind her flickered to a document. Not just any document. It was a scanned contract, high resolution, every line crisp, every mark legible. The title read in bold, Strategic Infrastructure Access Agreement, Confidential. Below it, two logos sat side by side, Orion Energy Holdings and a smaller watermark, MJJ Strategies LLC. The oxygen seemed to vanish from the room. Jasmine stood up and took a half step forward. "This," she said, her voice controlled but cold, "is a contract signed between Congressman Mike Johnson and Orion Energy Holdings, dated 6 weeks before Energy Bill 81 was introduced in this chamber." She paused, letting the room catch up. "It outlines a 20-year exclusive exploration and infrastructure lease in 4 U.S. states in exchange for offshore consulting payments totaling $7 million. She let her finger slide across the screen. Page 3, Clause 6.2. The recipient will facilitate legislative support for Orion's operational expansion. Before anyone could react, Jasmine changed the slide. The next page zoomed in, and there it was, Michael J. Johnson's signature, neat, curved, unmistakable. Just below it, the embossed seal of Orion Energy Holdings, flanked by two initials, AJM, the executive VP of the firm. The contract wasn't theoretical. It was executed, finalized, and sealed. Johnson's reaction was volcanic. He shot up from his seat so quickly his chair toppled backward with a bang. His hand pointed at the screen, but his voice came first, thunderous and cracked with fury. "Fake! That's fake! An absolute forgery!" He staggered a step forward, face turning deep crimson, veins flaring at his neck. "This is a setup, a blatant, shameless fabrication." The room jolted with the sound, some flinching, others stunned into stillness. Johnson didn't care. His rage was no longer strategic, it was survival. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't even raise an eyebrow. She simply turned to face him, her expression unreadable, almost pitying. Then she spoke, not louder than him, but 10 times more lethal. "This document was retrieved directly from Orion Energy's internal server. It has been authenticated by 2 independent digital forensic experts." The statement landed like a precision strike. It was not a rebuttal. It was confirmation, undeniable and surgical. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was suffocating. Lawmakers shifted, whispers stirred like wind through dry grass. Some leaned forward, reading the projected text again and again, as if hoping it would change. But it didn't. It was still there. Signed, sealed, undeniable. Johnson turned, scanning the room for a lifeline, a defender, someone, anyone to speak up. But all he saw were downcast eyes, frozen stares, and the quiet horror of those who realized they'd backed the wrong man. He opened his mouth to speak again, but no words came. He was surrounded by people, but suddenly he was completely alone. The contract had left the chamber stunned, but Jasmine wasn't done. Not when the final blow was still waiting in her palm. As the screen behind her faded to black, she reached silently into her folder and pulled out a small black USB. The kind of device that looked harmless until you knew what was on it. She didn't say a word. No warning, no announcement. She simply turned to the technician and gave a single nod. The chamber lights dimmed slightly as the speakers warmed to life with a soft click. Then came the voice. It was unmistakable, calm, casual, smug. As long as the money hits my account, the bill goes through. Mike Johnson's voice rang out across the room, raw and crystal clear. No static, no distortion, no mistaking it. The effect was instant. Lawmakers froze mid-breath. Staffers exchanged stunned looks. One aide dropped her notepad, the sound drowned by the replaying phrase that now echoed off marble and wood. Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't need to. The tape was speaking louder than anything she could say. Johnson jolted upright like he'd been electrocuted. His hand slapped the table. His chair screeched back. His face was flushed, eyes wide, voice trembling with volume and panic. "That's edited. That's a deep fake. Total fabrication." He turned toward the chairman, then to the audience, pointing, shouting, flailing. "This is manipulated. This is AI garbage." But his desperation came too loud, too fast, like a man running from a fire everyone else could already see. His voice cracked under its own weight. Jasmine, still composed, leaned forward and tapped the console again. The playback resumed, not just the damning sentence, but everything around it. The full recording unfolded in the chamber, like a curtain being ripped open. Johnson's voice continued, casual small talk, laughter, the sound of a glass being set down, a low rhythmic tapping, his signature nervous knock on wood. Then again, no paper trail, no problem. We push it through committee and bury the rest. Every sound layered the authenticity. Every second erased doubt. The room was silent now, but not empty. It was full of tension, embarrassment, and the quiet horror of realization. Lawmakers sat frozen in their seats, no longer looking at Johnson, but down at their desks, hands or nothing at all. Johnson reached for the mic again, but it was a broken motion. His fingers shook, hovering in the air like they no longer knew what to do. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. Then finally, barely a breath. A stutter, a swallow, a silent collapse behind his eyes. And that was it. The moment of no return. Not just because the tape was irrefutable, but because Johnson knew it. The entire chamber knew it. And Jasmine, she never had to raise her voice. She simply pressed play and watched his empire begin to fall apart in front of everyone. The audio had barely stopped echoing when Jasmine straightened slowly in her chair. The room was already reeling from the tape. People were visibly shaken, some still staring blankly at the monitor as if the sound of Johnson's voice had been carved into the air. But Jasmine wasn't done. Not yet. Not until everything came down. She turned her head slightly toward the chairman, not even raising her voice, but somehow commanding full attention with just one line. "Chairman," she said, steady and clear, "I'd like to call a witness." The room didn't gasp this time. It froze. Eyes widened, ears perked. Even the pen stopped scratching. After what had just happened, the contract, the recording, no one expected her to have more. And yet the tone of her voice, measured, final, promised something worse. Something irreversible. The back door opened with a quiet click. At first, the man who entered didn't look like much. He wore a simple suit, dark blue, slightly wrinkled at the cuffs. His gait was hesitant, but purposeful, like someone stepping out of hiding for the first time in months. Heads turned as he moved through the narrow aisle. Not fast, but not timid either. Every step echoed slightly on the chamber floor. By the time he reached the witness stand, at least half the room had recognized him. Daniel Kessler. Former chief legislative aide to Congressman Mike Johnson. Loyal staffer for nearly a decade, until he disappeared, suddenly, quietly, 7 months ago. No explanation, no press release, just gone. He stood in front of the microphone, clearly trying to control his breathing. His hands gripped the edge of the podium just tight enough to steady the tremble in his fingers. The room was silent again, not because it had been called to order, but because no one dared interrupt what was coming. Kessler looked up. His eyes were bloodshot but resolute. "My name is Daniel Kessler," he began, voice trembling but honest. "I served as Congressman Johnson's senior aide for nearly 9 years." He swallowed hard, exhaled through his nose, and then continued, this time louder, steadier. I handed Congressman Mike Johnson a brown envelope in his office. It contained $2 million. In cash, somewhere in the back of the room, someone whispered, "Oh my God," under their breath. No one turned to look. Kessler didn't stop. He looked at me, smiled, and said, "This is just the beginning." That was it. That one sentence detonated the room, not with sound, but with stillness. A stillness so thick it felt like time itself had stopped. Jasmine didn't say a word. She didn't need to. She simply watched. All eyes turned to Johnson. He didn't react immediately. For half a second, he didn't seem to register what had been said. But then, something changed. His pupils twitched. His jaw slackened. Color drained from his face like blood from a wound. He blinked. Once, twice, slowly, and his body, always firm, always straight, suddenly deflated into his chair, like it could no longer hold him up. His right hand moved almost subconsciously to his collar, loosened it, then to his forehead, where a sheen of sweat had already begun to form. His left hand still gripped the table, knuckles bleached white against the wood. But he wasn't holding on for control. He was holding on for balance, like the floor had just shifted beneath him. He opened his mouth, tried to speak, but nothing came, not even a grunt. His lips parted again, barely moved, then pressed together tightly like they were trying to seal a panic rising from within. A single bead of sweat rolled slowly from his temple down the side of his face. Another followed. His breathing, once deep and controlled, had turned shallow and erratic, like a man trying to catch his breath underwater. Across the room, lawmakers sat in stunned silence. Some stared at Kessler, others stared directly at Johnson, waiting, watching, almost as if expecting him to say something, anything to fight back. But he didn't. He couldn't. The man who had yelled, insulted, dominated the floor just moments earlier, was now frozen. There were no papers to flip, no microphone to yell into. No procedural rule to hide behind, just silence, and a witness whose words had shattered whatever was left of his defense. This wasn't a political wound. It was annihilation. His eyes scanned the room, desperate for an ally. He looked left, right. His gaze flicked toward familiar faces, staffers, colleagues, the chairman. But none of them looked back. Or if they did, it was only for a moment. Cold, brief, detached. Not one nod of reassurance, not one gesture of support. Every tie, every allegiance had quietly slipped away. Even his own legal counsel sat perfectly still, not offering a whisper. Jasmine remained composed. She hadn't moved since Kessler spoke. Her hands rested neatly atop the folder on her desk, expression unreadable. But beneath the stillness was something sharper, something quiet and deadly. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. Her silence spoke louder than applause, because this moment didn't need celebration. It was the kill shot. Climax 2, the final nail. The one thing even a forged document or a damning audio couldn't do alone. A living witness, flesh and blood. A man who looked Johnson in the eye and said, "I gave you the money." And Johnson? He was unraveling in real time. The temperature in the chamber felt different now. Hotter, thicker. Even those who'd once defended him sat motionless, choosing silence over loyalty. Every breath he took sounded heavier than the last, as though the weight of the moment had settled directly on his chest. He tried to raise a hand again, but halfway through his fingers shook and he dropped it. Whatever fire had once fueled him was gone, smothered beneath truth, fear, and public collapse. No gavel had fallen, no verdict had been read, but the outcome was clear to all. Mike Johnson had just been publicly destroyed. Not by attack, not by slander, by a fact, and a face he couldn't erase. And Jasmine? She never raised her voice. She didn't need to. Truth, spoken by someone who once stood beside power, had done the job better than thunder ever could. The witness had delivered the final blow, but no one moved. No one even breathed loud enough to disturb the weight now hanging in the room. The silence was so complete, it didn't feel like quiet anymore. It felt like pressure, like the very oxygen in the hearing chamber had thickened. It was the kind of stillness that didn't ask for control. It demanded it. Every eye was locked on Mike Johnson. But this time, not with respect, not even with contempt, just stunned disbelief. The fall had happened so fast yet so slowly, like a skyscraper collapsing in silence, floor by floor, minute by minute, until there was nothing left to stand on. Johnson didn't say a word. He didn't argue. He didn't even lift his head. He sat slouched in his chair, face hollow, eyes distant, staring at nothing in particular. One hand was still on the desk, fingers slightly curled, as if he'd been about to grip something but forgot what it was. The other rested on his knee, lifeless. His mouth was slightly open, but no sound came. No explanation, no denial, no defense. Then he moved, slowly, as if gravity itself had multiplied. His spine curved forward, his head dropped, his shoulders sank. And just like that, the man who'd spent his career barking orders, bulldozing hearings, mocking enemies, and crushing dissent, lowered his forehead onto the cold, hard wood of the witness table. No gesture could have been louder. The microphones picked up nothing but the low hum of the chamber's overhead lights. From the back row, someone's breath caught audibly in their throat. Even that felt too loud. The scene unfolding before them didn't need commentary. It was already unforgettable. His face, now hidden from view, had turned pale, ashen, almost sickly. His entire body seemed to sag under the weight of exposure, like he'd aged 20 years in a matter of minutes. Sweat glistened behind his ears and pooled along the collar of his once-starched shirt. But there was no fire left in him, only collapse. And still, Jasmine hadn't said a word. She sat in silence, her posture unchanged, hands resting calmly on the manila folder that had, piece by piece, dismantled a political empire. She hadn't smiled, hadn't smirked, hadn't even flinched when Johnson cursed her, when he screamed, when he accused her of fabricating the very truth that now lay bleeding across the floor. But now, as the silence thickened to the point of suffocation, she moved. Deliberately, she reached forward and closed the folder. The soft click of the clasp echoed like a judge's gavel. She gathered the remaining documents, stacked them neatly, then stood up. There was no need for theatrics. Her authority didn't come from the chair she rose from. It came from what she'd just made the world see. Every eye shifted to her. Even those who doubted her at the beginning, who had rolled their eyes at her presence, dismissed her questions, whispered that she was in over her head, now stared in frozen reverence. She had not only held her ground, she had dismantled a legacy of power right in front of them. Not with rage, not with spectacle, but with facts and steel. She turned her gaze to Johnson. He didn't look back. His head remained against the desk, motionless. But that didn't matter. Her words weren't just for him. They were for the entire room, for history, for the silence that demanded to be broken. And when she spoke, her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It was precise, cold, measured, and it sliced through the chamber like the final chord of a symphony. Mr. Johnson, you didn't betray me. You betrayed the United States of America. The sentence landed like a steel hammer. It didn't shout. It didn't echo. It stopped time. You could hear someone inhale sharply near the clerk's desk. Another hand clutched the edge of a notepad, but no one dared speak. No one even turned their head. Jasmine's words hadn't just condemned a man. They had named a truth everyone else had been too afraid to say. Johnson remained folded forward. No reaction. No rebuttal. Just silence. And that silence said everything. The line didn't need applause. It didn't need affirmation. It simply was. Undeniable. Complete. Final. Even the walls of the chamber, lined with history, soaked in decades of debate and deflection, seemed to stand still, holding their breath at the weight of what had just been spoken. This wasn't politics anymore. This was reckoning. And Jasmine, she didn't smile, didn't flinch. She lowered her gaze, her work done. Because in a room full of power, ambition, and hidden agendas, she had done the one thing that echoed louder than any scandal. She told the truth. And now the whole damn room had to live with it. The words still echoed. You betrayed the United States of America. when the chairman finally lifted his gavel. For long seconds he had sat still, just like the rest of the chamber, frozen by the gravity of Jasmine's strike. But now he moved, slowly, firmly, his voice carrying the weight of finality. "The committee will initiate an emergency investigation," he said, every syllable measured, deliberate, impossible to misinterpret. His eyes didn't flicker, his tone didn't soften. "Effective immediately, all assets and accounts connected to Congressman Johnson are to be frozen until further notice." The gavel came down with a crack that split the silence. It wasn't just a procedural tap. It was a thunderclap, a verdict, a signal that this was no longer just a hearing. This was now a battlefield of law, and the first shot had been fired. The sound rolled through the chamber, bouncing off marble walls, leaving nothing in its wake but inevitability. A wave of unease rippled across the lawmakers seated around Johnson. Men and women who only hours earlier had nodded to him, whispered reassurances, even smirked at Jasmine's accusations, now avoided his eyes. They shifted in their seats, adjusted their ties, scribbled aimlessly on notepads that were already blank. A few outright turned their chairs away, shoulders stiff, faces angled anywhere but toward him. It was more than discomfort, it was betrayal, the kind that cuts without a knife. For Johnson, the impact was immediate. Just yesterday, he had walked these halls with certainty, with allies at every corner. Now, in the space of a single hour, he was radioactive. The silence from his former supporters wasn't neutral, it was lethal. Their refusal to speak, to defend, to even meet his gaze was the surest sign of all. He was finished. He tried to move. He tried to straighten in his chair, to reclaim even a sliver of the presence he once commanded. But his body didn't obey. His shoulders slumped, heavy as iron. His hands twitched against the desk, but couldn't find strength to grip. His head hung low, eyes wide but unfocused, as if staring through a fog that only he could see. The sweat hadn't stopped. It streaked down his temple, pulled at his collar, soaked into the fabric of a suit that now looked too large for him. He wasn't the powerful congressman anymore. He wasn't even a fighter. He was a husk, drained, emptied, motionless. His chest rose and fell in shallow jerks, the breathing of a man who had lost the will to argue, the will to shout, the will to stand. And all around him, the chamber moved on without him. One senator leaned over to whisper, "This changes everything." Another scribbled notes for the record, already phrasing the headlines in their mind. A staffer carried papers swiftly to the clerk's desk, marking the start of the formal freeze order. The world was already adjusting to life after Johnson, while Johnson himself sat frozen in place, a relic whose time had just expired. He turned his eyes once, desperate, toward the row where his closest allies sat. These were men who had built their careers alongside his, who had raised their voices in his defense countless times. But now, nothing. One fiddled with a pen, eyes glued to the paper in front of him. Another pressed his lips together so tight his face shook, refusing to look up. A third simply adjusted his glasses and shifted away. The movement small but unmistakable, distance. Johnson blinked, disbelief flickering across his broken stare. For years he had fed them, protected them, pulled them into his shadow. And in the end, not one would stand for him. Betrayal is often loud, but this one was silent, and it was worse. The chairman repeated his order. "This chamber recognizes the necessity of immediate action. An emergency investigation will proceed without delay. Asset freeze is non-negotiable." His voice cut through again, hammering the nail deeper. Johnson's head sank further. He lowered until his chin almost touched his chest. His lips moved faintly, as though whispering words no one could hear, words meant only for himself, regrets, prayers, excuses. No one leaned closer to listen. No one cared. The walls seemed to close in around him. The air was too heavy, too hot, too hostile. His heart pounded, not with fight, but with dread. The realization had finally landed. Not only was he powerless, he was abandoned. The hearing chamber, once his stage, had turned into a courtroom. And in that courtroom, he wasn't the legislator. He was the defendant. Still, he sat, immobile. A man chained not by law, not by guards, but by the collapse of his own empire. His arms were slack at his sides, his body unmoving except for the tremor of his breath. His eyes, once sharp and calculating, were glassy now, staring blankly at the edge of the desk in front of him. He was surrounded by people, yet utterly alone. Jasmine remained silent, watching. She didn't press further. She didn't need to. Everything had already been said. Everything had already been proven. Johnson's silence was louder than any denial he could have screamed. His stillness was the clearest confession of all. The lawmakers knew it. The staffers knew it. And Johnson himself, he knew it most of all. Minutes dragged like hours. No one dared break the silence with idle chatter. The only sounds were the shuffling of papers, the occasional cough, the scrape of a chair leg against the floor. But beneath those small noises lay something louder, heavier, the sound of collapse. The collapse of a career, a reputation, a life built on power now turned to dust. Johnson closed his eyes. His face, drained of blood, looked almost ghostly under the harsh white lights. His lips parted slightly, but his tongue didn't move. He had no words left. His mind screamed for defense, but his body betrayed him. There was no fight left to give. Across the chamber, one lawmaker muttered quietly to another, "It's over." The reply came as nothing more than a nod. Everyone knew it. Everyone felt it. The hearing wasn't about discovery anymore. It was about aftermath. Johnson sat as if carved from stone, but weaker than stone, softer than clay. He wasn't resisting. He wasn't defending. He wasn't anything at all. Just a hollow shell, drained of the very arrogance that had carried him this far. His eyes, unfocused and glassy, betrayed a man who wasn't thinking strategy or survival anymore. He was simply trying to breathe. The betrayal of his allies was complete. Not one word came in his defense. Not one protest rang out. Men who had once clapped him on the back now busied themselves with notes and whispers, trying to distance their futures from his ruin. He had become a liability, and in politics, liabilities are left behind. His shoulders sagged further, as if the weight of every betrayal pressed down on him at once. His hands, trembling now, slipped from the edge of the desk and rested limply in his lap. He looked small, shrunken, no longer the towering figure who had once controlled the floor with fire. The chairman's gavel struck once more. This hearing will recess until tomorrow morning. The investigation begins immediately. Another thunderclap, another verdict, another reminder that his time was over. Johnson didn't move, didn't blink, didn't even acknowledge the sound. He sat frozen, broken, eyes staring ahead into nothing, as though watching his empire dissolve into the air. His breathing was shallow, erratic, each inhale catching in his throat, each exhale weaker than the last. He was gone, spiritually, politically, historically. What remained was only the shell, and the chamber watched, silent witnesses to the fall of a man who had thought himself untouchable. The gavel's echo was still fading. Johnson sat hollow and pale, and the chamber held its breath as Jasmine stepped forward into the heavy quiet that followed judgment. She did not rush, and she did not posture. She set her folder down with care, squared the edges, and lifted her chin so the whole room could see her face. The overhead lights cut a clean line along the table, and in that line stood a woman who had not blinked through the storm. A few lawmakers shifted as if bracing for impact, but Jasmine kept her voice measured, certain. When she spoke, it was the kind of sound that stills the room without needing to shout. No one stands above the law. The bill that sells out our national interest will be stopped, and the truth will always defeat tyranny. The words were simple, but they landed like iron. They didn't fan flames. They ended them. Her sentence did not beg, bargain, or threaten. It announced a boundary and nailed it to the floor. The chamber absorbed it the way a body absorbs a verdict. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Pens hovered over pads without touching paper. Aides forgot to breathe. Even the low mechanical hum of the air system seemed to pull back, as if the building itself understood it had heard something final. Jasmine's eyes did not wander, did not search for praise or permission. She let the silence sit with what she had said. Across from her, a senior senator who had once smirked at every mention of accountability now stared hard at the tabletop. His hands were clasped too tight, the knuckles bloodless. the pose of a man cornered by a truth he could no longer dodge. A younger representative 2 rows back looked at Johnson, then at Jasmine, then down, as if trying to memorize this feeling for the rest of his career. Someone reached for a glass of water and thought better of it, hand retreating, afraid to break the moment with a clink. The stillness was not awkward, it was earned. Jasmine stood steady in it. The set of her shoulders said she knew exactly what her words meant and exactly how long to let them breathe. She had not come for victory laps. She had not come for applause. She had come to put a wall between the people and a scheme that would have sold them out. Then to make that wall official. The chamber could take its time catching up. Her message had already arrived. The quote hit different parts of the room at different speeds. For those who had rolled their eyes at the first hint of scandal, it arrived like an unwelcome mirror. For those who had endured the shouting, the insults, and the stalling, it arrived like air after a long dive. And for the ones who lived on the edge of procedure, the clerks, the counsel, the staff, it arrived like a checklist finally complete. 3 lines, 3 locks. Door closed. No one stands above the law. The front row absorbed that first line with a visible flinch. It was not a shot at a man. It was a line through a myth. The sentence did not name a party, a faction, or a friend. It named a boundary and put every person in the room on the same side of it or outside it. Even the skeptics knew there was no clever reply to that foundation. Either you accept the ground or you leave the ground. The bill that sells out our national interest will be stopped. That second line moved like a blade across the paper trail everyone had just seen. It did not relitigate the contract, the wires, the voices on the tape. It did not need to. It promised an outcome and tied it to duty, not to rage. The bill wasn't just bad. It was a betrayal dressed as policy, and the sentence stripped it bare. You could feel the resolve click into place like a safety on a lock. And the truth will always defeat tyranny. The third line was not poetry, it was a direction. It gathered the contract, the audio, the witness, and the silence, and gave them one name. It also reminded the room what had just died here, the habit of shouting down facts and calling it strength. Truth did not wrestle today, it simply stood. Tyranny in any suit or tone had nowhere left to sit. Johnson did not lift his head. He didn't have to for the room to understand that the line had reached him. His shoulders made the smallest collapse, a subtle fold, as if the chair had lowered an inch beneath him. The posture of power had drained out, leaving only weight. The man who once filled the room with noise now occupied less space than his shadow. The quote did not crush him. It revealed he was already crushed. At the dais, the chairman watched Jasmine like a judge who had just heard the last piece of testimony he needed. His hand hovered near the gavel but did not touch it. This was not a moment for wood on wood. This was a moment for memory. He nodded once, nothing theatrical, nothing for the cameras, just a single, professional acknowledgement that a standard had been set and he intended to hold it. A clerk scribbled the words verbatim, careful with every letter. On the third row, a veteran member, silver hair, steady hands, exhaled for the first time in what felt like an hour. He had seen scandals come and go, storms rise and pass, but he had not often seen a sentence close a door this cleanly. His eyes slid to the exit, not to leave, but to measure. Would anyone try to bolt? Would anyone try to talk this down in the hall? No one moved. No one dared to be the first to break a line that strong. Jasmine let her hands rest lightly against the folder again, as if sealing the words to the record. She did not add a flourish. She did not repeat herself. In a building addicted to speeches, she had delivered judgment in 3 lines. The restraint was part of the power. The chamber was forced to sit with the core, stripped of filler, stripped of noise. Even the lights seemed brighter, as if the dust itself had decided to stand at attention. The phrase, above the law, echoed differently in different hearts. For those who had counted on size, rank, and connection to dodge consequences, it sounded like the end of an era. For those who had stayed quiet because shouting felt safer, it sounded like permission. The sentence did not ask them to be brave. It asked them to remember what their oath meant. The oxygen in the room didn't just return, it refreshed. In the gallery, a staffer stared at Jasmine, the way a young athlete stares at the finish line they've trained for but never seen. It wasn't hero worship, it was recognition. This was what it looks like when the law speaks without screaming. This was what it sounds like when proof does the heavy lifting and a single voice gives it shape. The staffer lowered her pen and blinked, committing the cadence to muscle memory. On the far aisle, one of Johnson's oldest allies finally moved. He didn't stand or speak. He adjusted his chair to face the center aisle instead of Johnson's table. It was a small pivot, but it was complete. He had crossed, not parties, not loyalties, but realities. The room noticed. No one commented. There are betrayals that bang doors and betrayals that click locks. This one clicked. Jasmine's gaze stayed forward. She was not tallying conversions or counting heads. She was marking a standard, and standards do not check attendance. The same even tone that had cut through the insults now held the room without strain. She did not soften it for friends or press it harder for foes. A level voice was the point. Equal pressure, equal law. The microphones captured a tiny electric hiss before settling again. The sound almost underscored her words like a low chord under a chorus. It framed the moment without trying to steal it. A camera light blinked red, then steady, then red again. Equipment catching up to purpose. You could imagine the caption already, but the room did not exist for captions. It existed to make what she said real. The lines did not require anyone to agree. They required the chamber to behave. Above the law was out. Selling the nation was out. Tyranny losing to truth was not a dream. It was today's business. Even the skeptics, those who specialize in loopholes, could do the math. The ledger in front of them was not rhetorical. It had numbers, names, dates, voices, and now a standard that matched them. If anyone expected Jasmine to lean into triumph, they misread the mission. She did not lift her chin higher or let her shoulders relax into celebration. Accountability is not a party. It is a posture you hold until the job is done. Her stance said she would hold it as long as needed. No more, no less. The words were not a curtain call. They were a guardrail. Johnson shifted, barely. The movement carried the weight of a fallen tree trying to remember wind. His eyes were glassy, unfixed, floating somewhere between the table's wood grain and a future that had closed its door. The sentence had not shouted him down. It had simply left him nowhere to stand that did not answer to it. A man cannot outrun ground. He can only fall on it. The chairman's counsel leaned in to murmur something procedural. Tight timelines, documented chains, a formal notice on the freeze. The chairman nodded, but his eyes stayed on Jasmine. He understood that paperwork moves because people decide to move it, and people move when a line is clear. The 3 lines had done that. They weren't policy. They were permission to stop pretending not to see. Back near the wall, a young intern steadied a recorder with both hands. His fingers trembled, not from fear but from focus. He would go home tonight and try to explain to friends what it felt like to watch a room change its mind in 1 minute. He would fail. You can't explain the way silence shifts when the truth finally walks in and sits down. You have to be there. He was. Jasmine let the quiet stretch one last time, not to savor it, but to lock it. The mind remembers what it has time to breathe. The room breathed, careful and even, as if exhaling too fast might blur the ink on the moment. A paper rustled, a cough was swallowed, a shoe scuffed and froze. She kept her eyes forward, giving the chamber the dignity of choosing where to stand without being told twice. Somewhere to the left, a cynic whispered, "We'll see." The words fell flat, swallowed by the same law they tried to dodge. Doubt is loud when truth is quiet. It is quiet when truth is sure. Today, the truth was sure. 3 lines had set its pace, and the room was keeping it. The cynic leaned back and said nothing else. The quote did not need a signature, a flourish, or a frame. It stood on its own legs. It carried its own weight. It promised only what it could enforce, and enforced only what it had proved. That is why it hit so hard. That is why nothing in the chamber dared to move against it. She glanced once at the folder, not because she needed more proof, but because habit lives in order. Then she lifted her gaze again and kept it level. The moment did not end with applause, and it did not fade with chatter. It simply pressed itself into the record. Voice, posture, silence, until it became part of the building. Long after the lights would cool and the seats would empty, the room would remember where the line had been drawn. And Jasmine, the same as when she walked in, stood inside that line without strain. Her words had not asked for loyalty. They had asked for law. They had not fought for headlines. They had fought for ground. No one stands above the law. The bill that sells out our national interest will be stopped. And the truth will always defeat tyranny. 3 locks, clicked shut. 3 orders, already in motion. 3 sentences. Enough. The last syllable of Jasmine's vow still hung in the air, and the chamber felt newly carved. Clean edges, hard truths, no room left for fog. The gavel's echo faded into a charged quiet, the kind that makes even steady hands aware of their own pulse. Everyone knew what had just happened. They were only waiting to hear it named in a way that would live beyond this hour. Jasmine didn't reach for more files or louder words. She reached for something deeper, the thing that outlasts paperwork and fear. She lifted her gaze and let it land where the law lives, on the record, on the people, on the oath. Her voice was steady, almost gentle, but each word carried a backbone of iron. Justice can be delayed, she said, but when it arrives, it sweeps every lie off the table. The sentence didn't roar. It settled like a verdict across every seat. It was a promise to the honest and a warning to the clever. The line unfurled through the room in slow, inevitable waves. A clerk, hands trembling, wrote it verbatim into the transcript, each letter pressed like a seal. A veteran member exhaled, the tightness leaving his shoulders with a visible release. 2 younger lawmakers traded a glance that said they would remember this cadence for the rest of their careers. The air changed temperature. Not warmer, not colder, just cleaner. Jasmine didn't move to command the moment. She allowed it to reveal itself. Her hands rested lightly on the closed folder, a quiet anchor in the storm she had already calmed. The sentence kept working after it was spoken, as if the walls themselves were repeating it back. Delay is not defeat, it seemed to say. Delay is the shadow cast by a truth that is still walking toward you. And today, it had arrived. Somewhere in the back row, a single pair of hands began to clap, hesitant, almost apologetic for breaking the holy hush. Another joined, then another, and the sound found its courage. It wasn't loud at first. It was honest. A rhythm formed, not frantic but firm, gathering resolve like a drumline assembling from silence. The room chose to stand with its feet before it stood with its mouths. Row by row they rose. Chairs whispered against marble. Papers slid back from the brink, and the chamber got to its feet like a body relearning how to breathe. The applause thickened, deepened, rolled forward in waves until it filled the room end to end. It wasn't celebration for a person. It was relief for a principle. They weren't clapping for spectacle. They were clapping because the floor felt solid again. Jasmine didn't bow, didn't soak it in, didn't turn the moment into a mirror. She held the line she had drawn, eyes level, breath even, the applause washing past her like wind over stone. A small nod, barely there, acknowledged the oath they all shared. Her words had not asked for praise, they had demanded posture. The room was answering in the only way it could, upright. On the other side of that ovation lay a silence, and in the middle of that silence lay Mike Johnson. He had no reply left, no angle, no shield. His hands sat open on the table, palms up, empty of the bluster that had once defined him. His face was drained, the color washed out like ink in rain. He did not look broken by force, he looked hollowed by truth. He tried to lift his head once, as if to reclaim a fragment of presence, but his neck refused the command. The ovation moved around him the way a river moves around a stone, unbothered by his weight, uninterested in his protest. His eyes did not focus. They floated somewhere between the wood grain and the memory of power. The sound of hands only made the quiet inside him louder. He was present in the room and absent from his own name. The erasure began not with shouting, but with simple acts. A committee aide reached forward and turned his brass nameplate face down, the metal making a soft, final clink against the desk. The clerk drew a straight line through his name on the hearing roster and wrote 2 words in the margin. Under inquiry. A sergeant-at-arms stepped to the edge of the aisle and waited, not imposing, only making space for what the rules would soon require. Nothing dramatic, everything decisive. A longtime ally adjusted his lapel pin, then quietly unpinned it, the shared emblem they once wore to signal a block. He set it in his pocket without looking up and angled his chair away, a pivot so small it spoke louder than speeches. Another former supporter slid a folder toward the center of the table and folded her hands, choosing neutrality because there was nothing left to defend. These were not betrayals with slammed doors. They were betrayals with closed books. The ledger had flipped and his line was read. The applause did not spike, it sustained, held at a pitch that said, "We have heard, we have seen, we will remember." It was not joy. It was relief braided with resolve. In each clap lived a quiet rehearsal of duty. What to do tomorrow, what to sign, what to stop. The sound rose to the ceiling and came back down cleaner. And with every cycle, the sentence held, "Justice is slow sometimes, but it does not forget the address." Jasmine let the room complete its choice before she moved even a fraction. When she finally shifted, it was only to square the stack of exhibits on her table, as if sealing them back into order now that their work was done. Her face stayed composed, shadowed by the same even light that had followed her through the entire battle. The point of today was not her victory, it was the return of balance. A nation is heavier than a headline, and she carried it with economy. Johnson's breath came shallow, then shallower, each inhale hitching like a machine that had run past its design. His fingers twitched once, twice, the last reflexes of a grip that had let go. The chair that once seemed too small for his swagger now dwarfed him. He sat in it like a man lost inside his own coat. The ovation did not humiliate him. It ignored him. Nothing is lonelier than being unseen in the center of a crowd. The chairman did not add a speech to the tide. He respected the scale of what was happening. He kept his hand off the gavel, allowing the chamber to write this cadence into its own bones. Counsel leaned in to whisper logistics, but he waved them back a beat, understanding that sometimes law is best served by a full minute of moral memory. The building in its way was learning a new muscle. Stand when truth stands. Sit only when it's seated. Near the door, an intern had tears on his jawline he didn't think to wipe. He clapped on beat, eyes on Jasmine, absorbing not the personality, but the method. Facts before fury, order before outrage, consent of the governed before comfort of the powerful. He would tell this story badly for years, because words would keep failing to catch the weight of this sound. You have to hear a room decide to be a room again. The ovation crested, held, and then began to land in careful stages. Palms softened, shoulders lowered, chairs sighed back into place. No one spoke at once. No one rushed to fill the space with spin. The quiet that followed was not empty. It was earned. The silence of a job done right in plain view. And the message kept ringing, without sound. Justice took its time, and then it took the lies. On the table, the flipped nameplate caught the light like a tiny mirror, reflecting nothing but ceiling and steel. The clerk's line through his name looked thin on the page, but in practice it was a canyon. Johnson's eyes fell on neither. They drifted, unmoored, to some blank middle distance where power is a rumor and the future is undecided. He remained seated because there was nowhere left to stand. The room did not wait for him to find footing. A senior member finally broke the hush with 5 soft claps, not restarting the thunder, but sealing it. Heads nodded. Papers shuffled. The hearing would continue in the world of motions and memos, but the truth had already finished its part. Jasmine did not need to repeat her line. The chamber had adopted it. Delayed is not denied, lived in their posture now. Before anyone moved to adjourn, the moment wrote one last detail in ink thicker than the record. A staffer slid the placard tray back into the desk drawer and locked it with a quiet turn, as if closing a vault. The key was returned to its hook. A small red tag, temporary, procedural, unimpeachable, was placed on the corner of Johnson's binder. None of it shouted, all of it spoke. If justice had a gate, it walked through this room the way light moves at dawn. Slow to arrive, impossible to stop, revealing dust as dust and metal as metal. Lies did what lies always do when the day actually comes. They curled, shrank, and disappeared into the edges. The chamber stood, then sat, then steadied. The oath on every tongue felt newer than it had an hour ago. And the name that once swallowed air had been, in the simplest, most devastating way, erased on the spot. The ovation still echoed in the chamber, fading like thunder after a storm. But the room wasn't ready to slip back into routine. Justice had been declared, lies had been shattered, and silence had been broken. Yet Jasmine knew this moment wasn't meant to live only in transcripts or headlines. It had to be carried beyond these walls. She straightened, her hands resting firmly on the table, and her voice cut through the lingering applause with the same clarity that had brought a man to his knees. "Justice doesn't end here," she said, her tone sharp and unshakable. "This chamber has spoken, but now the people must act. Hold every leader accountable. Question every deal. Refuse to be silenced by money, by power, or by fear." Her words didn't drift. They struck like sparks, one after another, igniting the room with urgency. Lawmakers leaned forward, staffers froze mid-note, and the gallery listened as if history itself was demanding their attention. She stepped closer, eyes locking with faces across the aisle, across divides that had felt unbridgeable minutes earlier. "This nation belongs to you," she continued, each syllable weighted. "If you want truth to stand, then stand with it. Don't wait for others. Don't hide behind titles. Rise when justice calls your name, because democracy survives only if its people fight for it." The sentence slammed into the chamber with a finality that made hearts beat faster. The moment felt less like the end of a hearing and more like the opening of a march. Jasmine's voice lingered even after she sat down, an unspoken command hanging in the air. "Do not watch. Do not wait. Move." Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.